Welcome everyone and everyone present, and we have an overflow room and those joining with us virtually. I am Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association, and on behalf of AERA, the American Statistical Association, and the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics, COPAFS, we are really pleased to be able to have this birthday party with everyone joining us and everyone who might join us subsequently. It really is a pleasure to be able to take this moment, in the infancy of a child, of an organization, or of an institution. We celebrate days and months and years, and then after a while, it's kind of a decade. So I think the last official commemoration might have been at 125. And so 150 is a really significant moment to both acknowledge the strengths of the federal statistical system in the United States, which is a distributed system of agencies, statistical agencies across many departments and agencies, and also especially to reaffirm the second oldest agency, NCES, and the important role that it has played in building data and knowledge that really can inform policy and practice, and has in iterative ways over the years. And so we're really pleased to take this occasion, and those of you here, of course, will be able to join our reception. To stop from the NCS emphasis, to really introduce Congressman Paul Mitchell, a fan of data, statistics, and accurate and reliable information that is so important to the work that we all do, whether it's the statistician hat, the scientist hat, the policymaker, or the practitioner. He serves on the Education and Workforce Committee, and most recently, and I want to emphasize the most recently because he's really contributed in many significant ways, he introduced the College Transparency Act, which indeed links to be able to provide to parents and families accurate and meaningful data that can inform college choices. So I want to thank the Congressman for coming to the Dirksen building and for offering some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, it's a little scary to be in front of a group of statisticians, and I went to school in public policy and economics. I took the easy statistics class. I admit it, I did. But it's great to be with you here today about the importance of improving data and sharing of data in the educational world. I had a check. I was shocked when they said they're celebrating 150 years. I'm going, wow, that's quite impressive. And there's so much more that you can do and we can do by improving the quality and the quantity of data that is shared with the public. They're shared with people that use higher education. I spent 35 years in post-secondary education and workforce development, my entire career. It's a whole long story how I got into that. It was a rewarding time for me, most rewarding time in my life, as I helped people move their careers forward, to establish a career, reestablish one. We operated some of the largest welfare work programs in the country, when welfare to work meant going to work. Large career school group, we'll talk about that. More important for me, higher education became clear to me as an avenue for people to move their lives forward. In many cases, to move out of being poor, economic disadvantaged. I was the oldest of 7 in my family. My dad built trucks in the line. My mom worked at the Salvation Army. I was the first kid in my family, my extended family, to even step on a college campus, never mind attend a college. I didn't know how to choose a good college from a bad college. I got lucky. I turned down a scholarship at the University of Miami, Florida, marine biology. I lived in Michigan. I didn't know how to get to the University of Miami. I didn't know what it was. And Mom said I was going to be a lawyer. By the way, she didn't speak to me for 9 months. When I didn't decide to go to law school, she had no idea I was going to pay for it, but I was just a lawyer. I managed to convince her before she passed I was able to be successful despite that failure. But what it meant to me, was clear to me, is that through an education, I was able to start a career in workforce development, to work my way through that career and become CEO of a fair-sized company. And I committed my life to working with people that were trying to move ahead, themselves and their family. And it was incredibly meaningful to do. But what's also clear to me is that people were just guessing about how they were spending their money. Taxpayers spend hundreds of millions of dollars on higher education in this country. I'd have to guess at how much money that individuals pay. But I can tell you that in many cases, it's the largest investment a family will make is sending their children to college. I have 6 kids. There's a whole long story about that. I used to tease my family, my mom and dad, about 7 kids. What are we thinking here? I have 6. Slow learner. But the cost of sending your children to college is massive. Either you pay it directly or student loans, but still, it's a massive cost. Yet we're guessing. And why are we guessing? The early action deadline is pending right now for colleges and universities. People are making choices. Yet they have to guess whether or not they're likely to succeed, whether they can find a job. Will the job pay their student loans and their cost of living? You can't compare whether I went to Michigan State, I'll pick on them, whether the nursing program at Michigan State and the nursing program at the University of Michigan, which have a better chance of succeeding. Never mind getting a job. What are they going to make? You could look at some general information. This is critical information. Yesterday, I had someone that's not real fond of my bill. I know that shocks you to know that that's the case. Tell me, only 50, 60% of the students, they choose to go to college where they have a good social life, they like the band uniforms, the football team. So only 40, 50% of the people are going to care. My response is if we can help 40, 50% of the people that enter college, university, or post-secondary schools not to be ignorant, frankly, to give the information, I'll settle for that. More importantly, with the College Transparency Act, we can stop with all the reporting that was done by my institution and many others. Let's be honest about it. The definitions in IPEDS, the definitions of credit agencies, the definitions of all these groups don't match. We spent quality time trying to figure out how our data system could provide the information that was required by various agencies that we would submit, most of which the general public never saw. Is there anybody in this room that they have their kids going to college and they're able to tell me right now what the graduation rate is for that institution, what the employment rate is, forget whether it's in the field or not, and what the average earnings are for that field? Can anybody tell me that information? And the question I'd ask is why not? What's that? Go ahead, I want to. This is an open forum. I believe, it's all good. Trust me, I've been in places where people just yell stuff out. I know that surprises you, and you just deal with it, man. It's a whole transition on that. That's why I'm passionate about the College Transparency Act, because we will enable institutions to report information, much of which they already report, to a place that actually knows how to use the information, to aggregate the information, and draw information from Treasury Department about whether they're working and what they're earning. The other thing it does is it puts the information in a place that's never had a data breach. God knows that's not common in a number of places, including some, financial outfits and various other people. I believe it protects the information. What we've said repeatedly is it also puts out metadata on the outcomes to institutions by program, by location. In many states, in many areas, they have college scorecards. I mean, it's like giving a report card to the entire class. The data is relatively meaningless, to be blunt with you. And my university does it like many others. It's relatively meaningless because I can tell you the outcome rate from the architecture program at Michigan State University and James Madison College, where I went to school, are significantly different. I know that, but how many other people know that looking? We have a responsibility, and you folks are part of that, in making sure that we share that information broadly, that we insist at this point in time, given the technology we have, the experience we have in this room and across this country, and the commitment we have of higher education institutions. We have 130 different groups that are supporting this bill. To insist that we share with consumers, who ultimately are the decision makers, what they get for their money. We share with taxpayers what they're getting for their money. And yeah, I admit, we'll expose in some places that we've got some college offering a program in, ancient English or something with 6 students in it. Well, maybe we should talk about that too. Because we are responsible, both in Congress, and you're responsible for helping get the information, whether we're efficiently using what are, I hate to admit it, folks, they're limited resources. It's about time we do that. The other thing I'm absolutely committed to, and I know you are, but we have to start to convince people on a broader scale that we can protect this information so that all the information that's available on any student isn't available just willy-nilly around. That's aggregate data. I think part of what we have to tell people is we need to stop with the illusion of privacy while keeping people ignorant. I say that because 95% of the data we're talking about under the College Transparency Act, the government currently collects. I offered in a discussion with some people concerned about it that we could actually have a checkoff box that people that weren't getting direct financial aid could check themselves off that they didn't want their data submitted. I called it the Hillsdale Amendment, or Hillsdale Proviso. Just check off the box so you don't want your data submitted. That doesn't satisfy them. The reality is for any of you in this room right now, with your name, either your street address or your zip code, I can in about 20 minutes get data on what magazines you subscribe to, where you do online shopping, how much online shopping you do, what your estimated income is, how many times you voted, what your likely voting pattern is, and if we're walking door to door to vote, what questions to start with asking you so we can make some rapport and hopefully get your vote. So tell me how we're protecting your privacy by keeping people ignorant. And that's what the current system does. I am passionate about it because if some of you do not stand up and talk about this over the next few weeks, we're going to continue a process that will make minor, if any, changes to the current system and say, look, we're making it better. I spent 35 years in it. I am dismayed that we still can't tell people what their likelihood of success are. And we are responsible as educators, as statisticians for the system, to better serve taxpayers and the people that are undertaking education. And at this point in time, there will be a draft of a bill dropped in the near future. Your chance to weigh on that will come soon. I suggest you do so, or the train's going to leave the station. I have a couple of minutes if you want before they tell me I've got to vote. It's up to you. I'd be happy to answer questions, which is telling is me doing a part of, I do it all the time, my staff orders. They give me notes, I say things, and then they get worried.
Really, right? We'll print that version. Questions, comments?
Please go ahead. Oh my God. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the time. Enjoy. I was going to do the part you did with the reception with the wine, but I had votes and stuff. I was going to come for that because it'd be a lot more fun, but...
We'll send you a care package.
Oh, get that through security. Thank you very much, and thanks for asking me.
Thank you. All right. I can only imagine the questions that will later percolate at the reception, but Congressman Mitchell, thank you. This was... yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, one way we all join is in the production and in the use of high-quality data that can be used safely and securely, where privacy and data access are really considered together. And one of the best ways in which that has most recently happened is in the Bipartisan Commission on Evidence-Based Policy, where we see a real bipartisan effort to use high-quality data to make them accessible to the external research and statistics community, to government agencies, to better drive evaluation and policy with the data systems that we produce. Data are improved through that process, and perhaps no one in this room could speak to this better as a long-term federal official than our acting commissioner, Peggy Carr. So let me invite you to make some welcoming remarks to everyone. But as someone who's still holding the podium, not holding it tight, it's just a joy to have known Peggy, to see the quality of her work. You know, the significant impact that she's had on NAEP over the years, and that we've been able to wrest her to maybe from her true love to be acting commissioner for these years. And so as you make your welcoming remarks, we want to welcome you here and thank you for what you've done.
Indeed, the pleasure is all mine, and let me start my remarks by thanking you. Heartfelt, this is such an honor to be here amongst friends and colleagues and those who think about us on an ongoing basis. So thank you, the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics, of course, the American Statistical Association, and you, my dear, AERA. So I thought hard and long about my remarks today, and I thought I could wing it, but you know, this is so important. I don't think I want to do that. I did speak to my colleagues. Many of us have been there for decades, and we all have a lot to say, so I'm going to try to stick to my remarks today. The very first federal office of education was created in 1867 by Congress to collect, and I quote, "such statistics and facts as shall show the condition and progress of education in the states and territories, and shall aid the people of the United States in the establishment and maintenance of efficient school systems," unquote. Today, 150 years later, the National Center for Education Statistics is proud to celebrate this mission and to continue to report on the condition of education in the United States relative to other nations with relevant, timely, and high-quality data. The very first office, which legislation called Department of Education, was created during a period of rapid technological and economic and social change with the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Industrial Revolution. The first Morrill Act of 1862 granted federally controlled lands to states to establish land-grant colleges. Many states also greatly expanded their free common schooling. And yes, the federal Freedmen's Bureau opened publicly funded schools across the South, providing the opportunity of formal education for the first time to many former slaves. And at the same time, the President Andrew Johnson, signed the legislation creating our agency. At the exact same year, same day, Congress created Howard University for the purpose of educating Black clergymen, my alma mater. Educators have been advocating for decades for the creation of an agency to monitor and report on the condition and progress of the growing country's education system. In 1838, Henry Barnard, a prominent Connecticut educator, proposed that the 1840 census gather data on illiteracy and on the existence and condition of educational institutions. But in the effort to create the agency, well, it really did not begin in earnest until the annual meeting of the National Association of School Superintendents in Washington, D.C., in 1866. The superintendents drafted the bill, and the Congressman James A. Garfield of Ohio, a former teacher, who later became president and championed the bill in the House. And Henry Barnard, who had advocated for the collection of education data in the 1840 census, actually became the first commissioner. So obviously, a lot has happened since then. There have been name changes, such as the Bureau of Education, the Office of Education, and changes in the departments. The Department of Interior, then the Health, Education, and Welfare, and now the Department of Education. And of course, there have been changes in the structure and the mission of our education system. From its modest beginnings 150 years ago, NCES is now the third largest of the 13 primary federal statistical agencies. It is the go source of education statistics for policymakers, researchers, educators, parents, students, and media. NCES provides reliable, independent benchmarks for states, localities, and the institutions across this country, and it provides data for the international benchmarkings. NCES also provides deeper insights into our educational system through the lens of longitudinal surveys. Since the early 1990s, when I first joined the center, I can list for you a number of major milestones that define the comprehensive portfolio that we all know so well today. So here are just a few. Development of a comprehensive set of statistical standards that became a model for the federal statistical community. Implementation of a series of interconnecting longitudinal studies from birth to post-secondary. The evolution of NAEP, yes, our nation's report card, from a monitor of national progress to one that allows all states and more than 25 large urban school districts to monitor their progress on a common yardstick. Collaboration across countries to develop TIMSS and PISA and other international assessments that allow countries to benchmark their progress against each other. Strategic thinking, technological advances to gather efficiently a wealth of administrative data on K-12 and post-secondary schools while minimizing respondent burden. Dramatically increase access to our data for researchers and the public with powerful online data tools and a restricted access process that protects data confidentiality while facilitating in-depth data analytics. This includes greatly enhanced accessibility to our universe of data collections, CCD, IPES, through downloadable files and curated tools like ELSI, and I heard it earlier, the College Navigator, a great source for prospective college students and their parents. And finally, and perhaps not surprisingly to most of us, tremendous growth in our network of stakeholders. Like all other statistical agencies, however, there are still challenges to be reckoned with. Declining response rates as people are inundated with data requests. PII issues, security concerns, cybersecurity barriers, as well as declining human resources, yes, I mean fewer staff, in the face of a growing program of work. But there are opportunities that await us. We're doing pioneering work in digital data collection that's opening up a world of opportunities, producing improved accuracy in measuring constructs, allowing us to measure new constructs and making it easier to be more inclusive of students with special needs and really, quite honestly, for all through universal design features. We also have the capacity to collect better data on our processes. This is so exciting. And the actions that respondents take when they're interacting with our instruments. We're joining the emerging field of data science, where IT intersects with statistics and data analytics in the world of big data. And yes, we are enthusiastic about data leaking. You heard my colleague here mention that just moments ago. Opportunities for merging administrative data with survey data and with data from other statistical agencies to leverage our data, reduce our footprint and burden, and better serve our stakeholders. We are looking forward to the development of this new path in this area based on the recommendations of our Commission on Evidence-Based Decision-Making. So I'm so proud to be here today. Pleased to see so many people, many of them friends and colleagues that I've known for many years. It's cheering to witness such enthusiasm about a 150th birthday party for a statistical agency. It makes me think about a quote attributable to Bert N. Russell, who described the ideal character as including the intelligence that went so far as to enable a man to be moved emotionally by statistics. It gives me then great pleasure, if I have the honor, to thank our panelists today because they are a few ideas representing these characters that I've mentioned here. Jack Buckley, a friend and colleague of the American Institute for Research and formerly Commissioner of NCES. Larry Hedges, a dear friend and colleague for many years as well, of the Northwestern University and the current chair of the National Board of Education Statistics, which advises our parent organization, the Institute of Education Sciences. And where is Bridget? Bridget, welcome. Bridget Terry Long of Harvard Graduate School of Education and formerly the chair of the National Board of Education Sciences. I look forward to every word you have to say today. Thank you.
I think we're revved here. We're going a bunch of data wonks, users, producers, creators, and disseminators of knowledge, and the public interests with which we serve. We're going to have brief comments in turn. With such an illustrious group, why try to manage the creativity and the reflections that might flow? But we might hear a few personal tidbits about first encounters with NCES. And as I think Peggy so importantly emphasized, this is really a forum about reflecting on accomplishments, but also looking ahead. And Peggy certainly outlined some wonderful ones. Larry.
Well, I think it was pointed out that I'm the current chair of the National Education Science Board, but I'm speaking today not as a representative of the board, but as a statistician and an education researcher, and as somebody who, when I was quite a bit younger, spent a couple of stints as a visiting scholar at the National Center for Education Statistics. I was there long enough that people began to ignore me, so I feel like I got a good sense of how the place worked. And at the time, although I knew a lot about statistics, but I didn't know much about federal agencies, but one of the things that I think I learned when I was there is that the staff of the center is dedicated, hardworking, and utterly professional in every way, and that impressed me then, and I have not had any reason to change my opinion of the quality and the character of the people who worked at NCES and who still work at NCES. I formed the opinion even then that NCES is a national treasure. It's helped to provide the data that has improved American education. It has supported the developments of a diverse education research community, and it's vastly influenced the development of evidence in education beyond its own data collection by pioneering new methods of data collection for education purposes. I'd like to spend my few moments here reflecting on the impact of NCES over the last 40 years. That's roughly corresponding to my career, which is why I picked that time. When I started as an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in 1980, and I think about the state of education research in 1980 when I started and think about it now, I'm really stunned by the difference in the community that I've been a part of. And much of that difference is due to, directly or indirectly, the work of the National Center for Education Statistics. Let me start by talking about education assessment in the U.S. 40 years ago, the National Assessment of Educational Progress was conducted at irregular intervals, and it provided mainly a collection of item scores. That made it very difficult to assess what students knew and were able to do in subject matter domains like reading or math, and it made it hard to actually assess progress. But one of the things that NCES embarked on is moving the assessment into the modern age. They set it on a regular schedule, and they introduced the so-called new design that was new in 1980 that brought item response theory to bear on the national assessment. And that enabled the assessment to provide scaled scores in many subject matter areas to provide better summaries of what the assessment had found, and subscales that drilled into particular sub-areas of achievement, for example, sub-areas of mathematics. It made it easier to compare population subgroups, and actually easier to assess progress or lack of it in education through the scaled score system. Scaling, and I think one of the things that was quickly revealed by that are the inequities of progress across various population subgroups. That was important for us to know. Scaling was essential to enable relative statements about educational achievement, but in order to help facilitate absolute statements about educational achievement, the center helped to introduce achievement levels, which provided a way to sharpen absolute interpretation of achievement and changes in achievement through the assessment. In the 1960s, when NAEP began, states weren't interested in comparing themselves, and the design of NAEP was created in a way that wouldn't support such comparisons. But by the 1980s, the states had changed their minds, and they got interested in comparing themselves. And that led to NCES establishing the Alexander James Commission to study whether it was feasible or whether it was wise to expand the national assessment so that state-by-state comparisons would be possible. I remember talking to Emerson Elliott, who was commissioner at the time, and when I was joining that commission, and I am happy to say that the commission, after deliberation, decided that it was both feasible and wise to expand the national assessment to include state-by-state comparisons. That introduced a huge amount of complexity into the assessment, but it paved the way for the NAEP we have today, which is more complicated but also far more useful. As in most work that the center has done, and I'm not going to elaborate beyond the example from assessment, but there are many other examples, the work of NAEP was important not only in and of itself. It was really important because it introduced groundbreaking methods that are now used far more broadly than the NCES data collections. Just as one example, the use of complex patterns of missing data, planned missing data in NAEP, was really a pioneering thing when it was tried first, but now it's absolutely standard in every sophisticated large-scale assessment, and it's NAEP that is the reason for that, I think. They showed how valuable that could be. As just a little aside, that is also tremendously important to the broader statistical community. Multiple imputation was invented to support the operations of the national assessment with its new design with planned missing data. And for those of you who don't know, multiple imputation is widely used as the state-of-the-art method for handling missing data in statistical analyses, way beyond its applications in assessment. And I see that as a product of the work of NCES. Another thing, on another dimension, the development of a sophisticated national assessment led to clarification of psychometric thinking about the distinction between measurement and assessment. Assessment focuses on the distribution of scale scores in populations. Measurement focuses on the scores of individuals. It's possible to do assessment by doing measurement, by measuring everybody, but it's not necessary to do measurement to do assessment. And the clarity about this point that came out of NCES work has really had a huge influence on the design of assessments around the world. And speaking of the world, the National Center of Education Statistics literally created the standards that now drive international comparative assessments. There were international assessments before NCES supported TIMSS. In fact, TIMSS is the third international math and science study. But TIMSS utterly transformed the landscape of international assessments. Only those who've been involved before and after can really appreciate it. And when I say that they literally created the standards for international assessments, I can say that the International Association for the Evaluation of Academic Achievement, the IEA, when they produced their standards for international studies, the way they did it was basically to thinly veil a codification of what we did in TIMSS. And I can say that with authority because I was on the committee that helped draft that thing, and I remember the conversations, and people sort of generally turned to, well, what do we do in TIMSS? And those things usually became the standards. I can say that when the Organization of International Cooperation and Development, the OECD, Economic Cooperation and Development, started contemplating the PISA International Assessment, they turned to the experience of TIMSS. They couldn't have done it without the experience of TIMSS. Once again, I can say that it depended heavily on both the TIMSS experience and the staff that had gained experience in doing international assessments at a very high standard because of their participation in TIMSS. Those folks were absolutely critical in getting PISA off the ground. Well, once again, I can say that because I was part of the International Technical Advisory Committee for the first few years of PISA, and one of the things we talked a lot about is our experiences with TIMSS. I saw a lot of familiar faces, and there was a lot of shared references to that study. 40 years ago, there was only one NCES longitudinal study, NLS 72. I didn't find that particular study terribly useful in my own work, but high school and beyond was just getting off the ground at that point, and both that study and its successor longitudinal studies at the secondary level have provided the data that has built a vigorous tradition of quantitative education sociology and policy analysis that was impossible without those longitudinal studies. Subsequent longitudinal studies that have been added to the portfolio, the elementary ECHLs, the early childhood longitudinal studies, for example, have really broadened the kind of data that's now available for researchers in this tradition. They've allowed rigorous cross-sectional studies of questions like the effects of public versus private schooling and tracking, but maybe more importantly, they've helped us they've helped provide a data set that makes possible the study of development. You can't study development unless you measure the same people at different times. In other words, unless you have a longitudinal sample. And the work of NCES in the longitudinal study area has provided the best longitudinal studies available for studying American education and for studying questions that are fundamentally longitudinal about learning and about growth and development. It may be less well known, but in the last 40 years, NCES has made major contributions to supporting the development of administrative data. Perhaps the role that they played in supporting the development of state longitudinal data systems has the potential to be the most important of these contributions. It's too early to tell exactly what will eventuate from that, but in principle, it's a huge deal. We've never had the capacity to follow an individual child throughout their entire educational experience before. And I believe that if we're able to do that, to study and to know a child's entire educational trajectory, then we stand a good chance of being able to influence that trajectory for the better and for a more equitable set of trajectories around the country. The longitudinal data systems are not the only example of how NCES has supported the development of administrative data that they did not themselves collect. One of the examples that I think we rarely think about is the Common Core of data. We're kind of used to the idea that we can look in the Common Core of data and get information that's measured in the same way about every school district in the country. But that didn't just happen automatically. NCES worked for a long time with states to try and help them figure out whether they wanted to harmonize their data definitions, and ultimately they decided that there was value in that, and NCES helped them to do it. And without that help, I think we wouldn't have the Common Core of data as good a data source as we have it today. And I kind of see that effort that took place over decades, literally, as being a real triumph for the cooperation of a federal statistical agency and state initiatives to do something they wanted to do. I'll just stop by saying that I hope the next 40 years or the next 150 years is as transformative for the research community as the past 40 years has been. And I think there's every chance that it will be, because looking forward, Dr. Carr already alluded to some of the ways in which their work is likely to transform education data collection in the future. I just want to thank you, Dr. Carr, and your colleagues for everything you've done for us. Thank you.
Buckley has that second hat as having served remarkably as commissioner from 2011 to 2014.
So thanks very much, Felice. It's really unusual that I'm in a panel with people that know more about NCES than I do. It's probably even more unusual that I'm in a room where more than half of the people know more about NCES than I do. So I won't try to echo Peggy's masterful history, which I actually learned a couple tidbits in there that I hadn't heard, and I think I've given a history I don't know how many times. And I won't echo the sort of the greatest hits reel from Larry, because those are the same sorts of studies that I love and could talk about for hours and bore everybody. So instead, I'm going to probably tell some stories. First, I just want to get out of the way that it's a great honor to be here to help in some small part to celebrate the 150th anniversary of NCES. I was fortunate enough to serve at NCES twice. I was the deputy commissioner under Mark Schneider and Russ Whitehurst in the Bush administration, and commissioner, of course, under John Easton in the Obama administration. And it is not an exaggeration for me to say that working at NCES so far has been the greatest privilege of my professional life. In fact, I guess I missed it so much that I decided to become a swamp dweller and come back and work as a contractor for NCES, just so I could work on these same projects again. So, in that time, the brief time that I've been fortunate enough to be associated with NCES, I could tell you hundreds of stories. I could tell you stories about the dedication of the staff. One moment that unfortunately is stuck in my head because of the tragic events of this morning was a similar response to some tragic events in December of 2012 when we were there during the horrific shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary. And this is right in the holidays, staff are gone or leaving, and we were inundated with requests both from the media about school crime and safety and statistics and what could we say about everything from incident rates to how many armed resource officers are there on campuses. And then no sooner did the media requests stop than the administration began calling because they wanted to launch a legislative initiative immediately. And we needed all the same statistics but in much more detail. And I remember the skeleton crew of those of us who were there working nights and weekends into the holidays to try to answer these questions, and just without a second thought. And I was so proud of the staff those days. I could tell you stories about the historical role of the agency, how important it has been for understanding education in America, but Peggy honestly covered it better than I could ever have. I could tell you a story about the time I was late for a NAEP briefing because some reality TV show marched a couple dozen contestants right up the old executive office building steps right before I got to the gate. I don't know if you remember that one. It was standing there just fuming, but I can't cut the line, and they've all got to go in and do their whatever this intern for a day reality show. But instead of those stories, let me instead of telling pointless stories, tell some stories instead that highlight, I think, some important aspects of NCES, namely its role as a federal statistical agency. It's also its role in our nation's education research and science infrastructure, and its important contributions to education policy. And I'm going to do this with props. I actually brought props. All right, so the first one you may recognize. Certainly some people have been in the agency long enough. This is a thin volume drafted by a committee of the National Research Council of the National Academies in 1986, entitled Creating a Center for Education Statistics, A Time for Action. And I see some people nodding because they remember this. This was actually Bob Hauser's copy. He was kind enough to give it to me when I started at NCES. He said, you should read this. This is important. So, why? Why am I talking about this? This report actually, which was commissioned by the then OERI, the Office of Education, Research, and Improvement, is really the results of an evaluation of NCES. And in some ways, it marks the beginning, I would argue, marks the beginning of the modern era at NCES. It's a warning call, really, if you read this. It is a warning call of the actions that needed to be taken by NCES then to improve our data quality, standards, timeliness, accuracy, to put in place written policies and procedures, standards. Basically, in short, it told NCES and the Department of Education that without corrective action, NCES risked its status as being a federal statistical agency in good standing. It's saying, shape up or you're not really qualified to be a statistical agency. Because we're all here, you know what happened next. I'm very proud to say that NCES, under the leadership of several people in this room, rose to that challenge and made significant improvements over the next 30 years. So today, as Peggy said, by budget, NCES is the third largest statistical agency after Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and continues to play an important and respected role as a trusted, neutral provider of facts about all aspects of education in the United States. And they did it because they listened and they turned the ship around and built an agency that we're all proud of today. And so this new agency, this modern agency, follows the guidelines in my second prop, right, a book that I know many of you are familiar with, the famously purple Principles and Practices for a Federal Statistical Agency, which is another National Research Council volume. And indeed, I would say, the NCES, between two National Research Council volumes, has gone from one telling it better get its act together to one where it's held up as an example of several practices and principles. And actually, two of those I'd like to mention briefly, because I think NCES should take special credit for this. So these are the two practices that the Purple Book calls wide dissemination of data and cooperation with data users. Now, I know some researchers in the room are probably grumbling, at least on the inside, about our licensing procedures and the surprise security inspections and all the restricted data, the RUD manual requirements. But honestly, I will tell you, and believe me, I remember the calls and emails on the other end of those. But I will tell you, from being on the outside, the inside, contractor and academic, working with a lot of different agencies, data and state, federal, local, NCES within this broader statistical system was and is at the forefront of making data available through public use files, through controlled but really relatively open access for qualified researchers to restricted use data, through web tools like the DAS, which has long since gone away, but those of you probably remember that when the data analysis system under Dennis Carroll and the post-secondary group was like on a bunch of floppies that were encrypted, like, you remember floppies? And you had to take them and load them one at a time to get the file in because it was so big and then unpack the thing. That has long since gone away, so we now have disseminated, online table and model servers like the data cutting tools like the Data Explorer, Data Lab, right, and dynamic web reporting. That world has changed. But also, even while these tools and procedures were developed, NCES never stopped listening to its users. I've lost count of the number of technical expert panel twigs and tags and tacks that I've either read the reports of or sat on or even in a couple cases been a member of. But I can recall dozens of examples where those voices were listened to by NCES in the shaping of data collections and the changing of policies and procedures. And I would also add hasn't, in my experience at NCES, been limited to expert voices, that NCES, listens to public comments to the general public and tries to be responsive to practitioners and the public as well. And I think it's that spirit of openness and access that's made NCES such an important part of our research and scientific infrastructure. So the final report I want to share with you today is one you should all know, NCES 2007-482. If you don't remember all of the report numbers, this is mapping 2005 state proficiency standards onto the NAEP scales. This is it, yeah. You know this one. All right, so why this one? I chose this report out of potentially thousands because, frankly, it was one of the most interesting, controversial, politically fraught, and policy-relevant projects that I worked on while at NCES or anywhere else so far in my life. In fact, because of disagreements about methodology and because of concerns about the reaction of policymakers, there is no author of this report. This is one of the only two I can think of that the author is NCES. It is not a staff member, a contractor, a combination of staff members and contractors. It is the agency as if it were an entity. So if you don't remember, why am I holding this one up? This is the first of a series of ongoing reports that use data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress as well as from the states to illustrate an essential truth, that the states, while they were responding to the mandates of No Child Left Behind in assessment, had set their proficiency cut scores in very, very different places relative to each other. And as a result, this had great consequences for their reported rates of student and school success. So this report demonstrated, I learned two things from the process by which this report was produced and disseminated and discussed and attacked and defended. The first is one should never, ever underestimate the power of descriptive statistics in a policy debate. There is nothing causal in this report at all. There are no evaluation results. There is no claim that some policy works or some policy doesn't. There's no cost-benefit analysis. There is just these are the facts. This is the state of the world. And I'll never forget, just with that simple, I mean, it's not a simple report and the methodology is far from simple, but the conclusions are simple. Like all good statistics, they should be simple to understand, if not to produce. And I'll never forget presenting the findings from this report to policymakers like at the National Governors Association or the Council of Chief State School Officers. And after the angry questions stopped, watching them, seeing them realize that sort of the NCLB assessment system would never be the same. Secondly, though, this report to me also illustrates how only an impartial agency like NCES and only an agency and a government that's willing to make significant investment in an assessment program like NAEP could make this possible. And this is only one example of the sort of high-quality, impartial statistical reporting that I believe and have seen has had a real impact on policy, and the agency should be proud of it. So I'm probably over time. In conclusion, let me just say happy anniversary to a great institution. I used to say sometimes at NCES that our goal was to deliver rigor without the mortis. Assuming that I haven't succumbed to the mortis myself, I'd love to see what we've done at the 200th anniversary. So thank you.
Not to persevere on the hat analogy, but with Bridget, in addition to her academic role, we are privileged to have a former chair of the advisory committee for IES.
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you, and I'm so honored to be able to help celebrate this 150th anniversary. Obviously, it's going to be incredibly tough to follow Peggy and Larry and Jack, but I come to you really with a big thank you from the research community of how much NCES has done. And it only takes a second if you think about what we wouldn't know if this agency wasn't here, to realize just how important it is. So I come as an economist who's really seen the growth of the economics of education because in the early years, so many of those data sets. And as the former chair of the National Board of Education Sciences, being able to see a little bit behind the curtain about all the great work that goes into NCES from many, many staff members, and as well as some current projects that I have. So I'm here to say thank you. But if we pause for just a moment and think, did you know that there's been tremendous growth in the offering of kindergarten programs, but academic redshirting, the practice of delaying entry, has increased the variation in entering skills of students and so the supports that they need? This whole concept of academic redshirting, we didn't know anything about this, and now, because of NCES, not only do researchers know it, but parents also know it. Any elementary school parent understands a bit more about the students that are starting in our elementary schools because we have data that told us about these different trends and decisions that families were making. Did you know that there are 1.3 million K-12 students who are homeless? And this growing trend, schools have had to respond to and develop better systems to identify and support these students and to understand what needs, how we can better address those needs. Again, another fact that we would not know without NCES about a growing, unfortunately, but very important set of students we need to support. And did you know that since 1980, some 37 years ago, more women have enrolled in college and graduate school than men, and women were 5 percentage points more likely to complete a bachelor's degree in 2015 than men? So even the gender gap that we see in higher education, the area where I focus so much of my attention, which has actually been around for decades, the only way we know this is because of NCES. All of these points, these little facts, and I just spent a little time on the website, whether it's the condition of education, the many other reports that come out, not just for researchers, but for other stakeholders. They're so important if we're ever going to move the needle in education to make things better, because education truly is the most important investment that parents and communities and the government makes. And we can't actually improve it unless we know what works, what doesn't, what are the trends, what are the patterns, and that's only possible because of NCES. So we are able to know things about education, and Larry shed a little bit of light on where the state of education research was not all that long ago. But the fact that it's readily available, many of the data sets are right there for you to be able to look up a quick fact. It's for the entire country, which is a very important point. We do have other sources of data, and there's been tremendous growth, which has been fantastic. But NCES and the kinds of data that it collects is the only source that is nationally representative in many cases that crosses many boundaries. And so while we do have the growth of state administrative data sets and others that can link in very innovative ways, and this is what NCES has led with, it is one of the only sources where we can find out what's going on in the entire country. And so it's made lots of research possible just with its existence. And answering these kinds of questions, important questions about education, have been the backbone of important research. Now, this is not to say that NCES is perfect in all data collections, but it is dynamic, it is growing, and it is innovative. And so I want to just take a moment to acknowledge some of the ways, looking forward, what NCES has done to continue to push forward research. The first is framing collections not just in collecting random facts, but to actually help us make better decisions. You ask a question differently if you're trying to use that information to make better decisions. So it's not just about the current state of things, but the questions that have been asked, the surveys that have been out, they emphasize and have helped to frame where we should be putting our priorities and what we should be thinking about. So for example, the push to collect graduation degree completion rates for post-secondary institutions. Now, there's lots of debate about how we might do that, but just dipping their toe into the water has created a great deal of debate and continued innovation in letting us know, first of all, it's not just about college access, it's about college success. And where do we see students are performing well versus where they're not, which takes us to the next level of using these data to not only to be able to identify where there are problems, but also where there are successes. Because that gives us a chance to go back and study what are those institutions doing, what are those schools doing, what are those communities doing to actually produce better outcomes. A second great innovation has been the linking across data sets. The fact that even within the NCES data sets that you can link institutional data with student data to oftentimes even parent or teacher data to be able to look across, because we know education is not a simple endeavor. It takes many to produce whether it's good outcomes or bad outcomes, and being able to look at the multiple stakeholders and communities is important in order to be able to research and find out what works and what doesn't. As well as taking advantage of both state and institutional administrative data has also been important, linking in oftentimes low-cross ways to give us more information about what's happening in particular contexts has been an important innovation. But another way, a third way that NCES has been innovative is a current project that I'm working on, which I want to acknowledge has been very forward-thinking for NCES. And that is the fact that data collection is not only an opportunity to take stock of what's happening, but also an opportunity to start to test some of our theories about how we might better support students. So I've had the privilege of being part of a project where we've been piggybacking off of the NCES collection, which has been a survey of 90,000 college students, finding out how they're paying for college and how they're progressing through college. And working with NCES and with others, we have a special project where we are recontacting some of those students, the ones who have given us consent to do so, and have designed a research project where this past winter and spring, we actually sent those students doing more outreach, information about financial aid forms, about the benefits if you take additional college classes, how you might get through faster. And we currently have a follow-up survey in the field where we're asking them questions, not only did you fill out your financial aid forms, which we can now get with some accuracy, but how did you fill out your financial aid forms? How did you approach this? Who helped you? What were some of the challenges? And so by working with a data collection that was already a part of NCES, which they've collected every several years and gives us such critical information about issues of affordability, for example, in higher education, we are now also testing, by reaching out to those students, how we might better support them. So a data collection alone, just for facts, is not where we've stopped, but actually going forward and thinking about how we can use these interactions with students, not only to get information from them, but also to push information back to them with the hope of better supporting them. So again, I want to say thank you from the research community. I could give you many, many more examples, but I know I'm probably standing between you and the reception. But to say the lines of research, the creativity, the innovation, the students I have who have come into my office who've noticed something in their one school, either personal or professional experience, and they wonder, do we see that more broadly? Can I get some data to play around and understand whether or not this problem is also in other communities, as well as are there potential solutions? The fact that NCES is the backbone for the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that many young researchers, as well as old researchers out there, use to try to find solutions to improve education. So much of that work would not be possible, and I look forward to the future when I know so much other good work will come because of the good work of NCES. Thank you.
So we will do toasting in another venue, but this might just be a wonderful moment for those who want to raise issues, to those on the forum panel, or have a significant reflection, story, accomplishment that you would like to share with the group. We have mics, and we would love to hear from you. Everybody? Well, to get the creative juices going a little bit, let's maybe at least raise with each of our panelists. If you had a crystal ball here, and it was the 175th, what would your vision be of what NCES should be grappling with? Peggy's noted some. We've certainly been thinking a lot about data linkages, data opportunities, working across sector and the significant role of education to issues of labor force and health. So I think it's a nice opportunity to at least pick your brains in conclusion about what your dream would be about what we could tackle, where NCES would continue really to drive not just our knowledge about education, but our knowledge about all persons in our society, and as Larry pointed out, internationally. Go with it.
So I went last at the podium, which I actually think is the hardest, and they're making me go the first now with the questions. I think a challenge, but also an opportunity. As our country becomes more diverse, not only in terms of our students and families, but the types of schools that are out there, the types of educational pathways, there's a greater need for even more data. We need to be able to capture all different slices. And so, for example, older non-traditional students. It's wonderful that NIPSAS captures a number of those older students. But education doesn't stop at grade 12, and it doesn't stop at grade 16. And for many, it's going for a while, stopping out, going back. How do we think about lifelong learning, and how do we capture that? How do we capture the growth of homeschooling? How do we capture the growth of other new forms of institution and education, taking online courses? So how do we start to incorporate this growing diversity and delivery and student profile and pathway, which definitely calls for even more data to try to understand how people are navigating through these systems. And I look to NCES because one great question I have is how do we capture that with the growing technology? Maintaining high response rates as people are less likely to respond, and whether it's phone or mail or other things. How do we stay connected with various communities to learn from them, but also continue for that to be a two-way street? Disseminating that information back to those communities to see, again, I gave in the beginning of my talking points, key facts that are now just things that are known, which people may not actually link all the way back to NCES and realize how that's benefiting their lives. But to bring that full circle, that this is, communicating with NCES to learn about these broad experiences feeds into making everyone's lives better.
So I refuse to be pessimistic at a birthday party.
Good.
Normally, I would have a fairly pessimistic answer to that. Nothing against NCES, but the challenges facing the federal statistical system, and quite frankly, the challenges, we're living in a time where there's great challenges to the notion of expertise or science or scientific knowledge, which are a lot for all of us to tackle, and we're not going to be able to do it if we don't all help each other. I think that the great, with all challenge comes an opportunity, right? And the opportunity here is to prove the case again. So in the history that Peggy and Larry spoke of, in education research, NCES had the luxury of being sort of the only game in town for some of these issues. And now that's not the world we're in, right? There are a lot of people who think it's a waste of your time to go and collect these massive data, sets, and we've got so much data in the internet already. Can't we just use that, right? Or there's commercial providers, or to the congressman's points earlier about what's available to whom and how fast someone could go get it. And the point is, it's our job, it's your job at NCES, and our job to help you continue to point out that that's not sufficient, that without careful thought and design and scientific inquiry, that a lot of data is a lot of garbage, and that only turning those into useful information requires knowledge and expertise. And we have an opportunity to show the world that again, right? As an agency, as a statistical system, as those of us who are researchers supporting you in every way, to point out that while there's a great amount of new data possibly available, and that there's a lot of new linkages that are made possible, that there's new ways to trace process and assessment that we've never had before that we're really excited about, to use all that for good, to increase our knowledge, and to prevent its misuse either through ascientific inquiry or through violations of privacy or confidentiality or all the other things we guard against. So I think it's going to be an interesting 25 years. But having seen what NCES has done in the past, I'm sure they're up to the challenge.
I think that one of the challenges that NCES is going to face, and I think that they're going to do well with it, as they have with challenges in the past, is how to think about the places where we need to innovate in design data collections, which is a lot of what NCES does, and the ways in which other data collections, administrative data collections, if you want to lump every non-design data collection into the same category, let me call it all administrative data, try to understand how we can capitalize on data collections that aren't designed to supplement and to perhaps to obviate some data collections that could be done in other ways, And yet, this is sort of building a little bit on Jack's point of how we can supplement those things we don't have to spend money to collect with things that we do spend money to collect that increase the value of the information that we can get more or less for free. I agree with the sentiment that there's a gee whiz aspect about big data that it's going to make obsolete surveys and all kinds of other data, surveys and experiments and everything else. Well, there's already evidence that that's really just not true. But there are some things that it will give us some leverage with, and figuring out which things those are and exploiting them and using them to make more valuable the design data collections we do, I think is going to be one of the new challenges. And then making design data collections in new ways that we haven't done before. And I think there's a lot of promise in technology to help us do that.
Yes.
Of you actually.
Take the mic, Tom. Thank you.
I believe the House today just passed the first piece of enabling legislation supporting the Commission of Evidence-Based Policymaking recommendations. And most of my work at NCES, I work at NCES, for those of you who don't know me, hi, focuses on sample surveys. And I'd really like to get your insights into, if we're going to make a foray into new administrative data linking that we're not doing now, like, where would you start? Do you have recommendations for where we might take a first crack at this?
So, Chris, as you know, this is Chris Chapman, everyone. So one place that NCES tried to start was in the longitudinal studies, right? So we looked, when NCES redesigned the high school longitudinal study 2009, right, the most recent iteration. This was in the early days of the explosion of 3 through 8 and once in high school testing and a whole bunch of other administrative data that were finally going to be available. And so we said, wow, wouldn't it be great if we piloted a linkage that no one's ever done before, where we combine the design data with the administrative data, and we collect for those sampled students in large states sort of their entire administrative record just for the sample and link it together. And unless things have changed since I've been gone, with 7 states that we went after since 2007, not one has ever agreed to do that. And so if I had to pick a place to start, normally I would tell you about some policy issue, or I would talk about a fascinating statistical issue, but in reality here, what matters most is the legalities and the legal dimension. The most important place to start is to lay down an infrastructure that state attorneys general, that the federal government, that any other actor, that parents can be happy with, that their students' data are safe. And until we have that infrastructure in place and that trust, we just haven't gotten anywhere in some of these key linkage projects that we've ever tried at that scale. Education, of course, those of you who are privileged enough to work in other areas than education is got to be the hardest. It's the hardest area I've ever worked in to get some of these things to happen, partly because we're talking about kids, even when they're not kids anymore, and partly because of the nature of the federalism of our country, right, and how many governments are involved in education. So I would say start with the legal and policy framework, and because if every time we've ignored it, it's come back and undermined anything we've tried to do.
I think there's 2 observations. One, relative to other forms of administrative data, state and federal, education data, the state longitudinal administrative data, and other systems that relate to it have really pioneered in comparison to other institutions. So we've got some existence proofs, though not pervasive. And Chris, you made mention of the evidence-based policy report, is really trying very explicitly to reconcile how data can be used in safe and secure ways that protect privacy and confidentiality, of which NCES, as several of you have observed, have really kind of pioneered that and pioneered access to those data in a form that can be useful and usable, but yet protected. So I'm I'm optimistic about the 25 years ahead, and although I share your view that explicating that well is a challenge that we as a collectivity in our society face. Data and statistics and sound knowledge matter, and I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Yes, name is Jamal Abdulalim, education editor at The Conversation, well, at least as of November 20th, I will be. I'm supposed to be on vacation, but I guess I don't know how to vacate.
You couldn't miss a birthday party, right?
Right. So when you look at a number of the federal initiatives that were recently implemented or are being contemplated, such as the College Scorecard or the College Transparency Act, there's kind of this idea that if only we had more information, then students and their families would make better decisions in terms of where to go to college. However, when you look at some of the research, such as maybe Jonathan Smith out of Georgia State University, and the take-up rate of the College Scorecard is just not being used, it's not being utilized, especially by lower-income students and families to the degree that I think people thought that it would be. So my question is that even if we get better data, that theoretically enables people to make better decisions about where to go to college, how do you ensure that that data is actually utilized in that manner? Thank you.
So really, really great question. And I think this underscores the importance of NCES and a federal agency, but also the limits of what it can do in this larger landscape. So the point that the congressman brought up about taxpayers are paying all this money, families are spending all this money, there's also time, and we don't understand what the outcomes are. And what we really want to try to help students do, particularly as their post-secondary or any kind of educational training decision becomes higher stakes with not only the tuition, but the loan debt and everything else, is try to give them better information. In order to give them better information, we first must have that information. And that's the thing that a federal agency can do when you need to know for all institutions, particularly those that are participating in federal financial aid programs, and requiring them to submit data so that we actually can have that baseline of information. Without that baseline of information, we can't go farther there. But you are right, with the College Scorecard, when these were released, there was a lot of disappointment about were people actually using them, and they should actually be downloading data for at least 2 institutions so you can make comparisons. I think that's more of a problem of implementation. So NCES can create the data, and there actually are a lot of well-meaning partners out in the field who want to use that information and actually who can bring the innovation to try to figure out how do we, first of all, package that data. Because while we can know 300 pieces of information about any institution, that's a bit overwhelming, and too much information is probably a bad thing as well. But we have made a lot of progress in understanding, well, what should we prioritize? What are the 3 key facts that families need to know? And then how do we put that information in a way that's actually understandable for them to start to make different decisions? We made progress on that, but I don't think we got across the finish line by any stretch of the imagination. But it still doesn't change the fact that the foundation of that is having good information and knowing the different outcomes. And where I see NCES going is as we get beyond just knowing graduation rates for first-time full-year students to thinking about lots of other different profiles, because many of the students are going part-time, or they have your Pell Grant recipients or other kinds of things. We'll get better information, but we need partners in the field to figure out, well, how do we do the outreach? How do we package that information? How do we have continual conversations? And that's where you see growing partnership with the schools, with counselors, with the universities themselves. So it's an important piece of the puzzle, but the agency does the most critical role that no one else can do, but it can't do everything to get it across the finish line.
Yeah,
Can I,
all right.
can I add that I think Bridget is exactly right. But one of the responsibilities, I think, of statistical agencies, and it's a responsibility I think NCES has really taken seriously, is trying to understand how users interact with the information that they provide. And at least I know of at least a few really terrific efforts to try and better understand what people are making out of the information they're providing, so that they can so that they're communicating clearly the things they hope to communicate. And I think that that's an ongoing responsibility of the agency, because it never, the problem never ends of trying to help improve communication. But the agency can't do everything, but that's one of the things you can do and that you have been doing, I think.
This is one I think all of us could talk about for a really long time. I smiled when you asked the question too, because John Smith and I were colleagues at College Board when he first started doing that research, and so I'm very familiar with it. I was at the department both for the creation of College Navigator and then for College Scorecard, and I think other than the data elements that are available in the world, and right, so to Bridget's point, a lot of the conversation is about, if we don't even get these data and link them, we can't even make decisions about how to present them and who should, be incentivized to use them, or how do we encourage people to use them well and responsibly. And so there's always the issue about, what's out there that we can collect and what's out there that we can make available. But, I would draw a distinction between the Navigator, which is the older of the two tools that sits on top of iPads, and College Scorecard, which has a little bit that wasn't in iPads, but mostly a lot of the same information, is that the College Navigator has tons and tons of data fields in it, and it really does not make a normative decision about what you should be looking for in a college. It says, here's what's out there. What do you, figure it out. What do you want to search for? College Scorecard goes probably too far the other way and pares everything down to a small set of information on the theory that people can't attend to a Navigator-sized interface, which is, there's evidence for that. But it does in doing that, sort of makes a lot of strong decisions about what you should be looking at in a college that are not, in my view, are not necessarily supported empirically with this is what matters most for your decision-making process. And so I think the truth is going to be in the middle. We need more data, but we need to build interfaces that are respectful of people's choices as students, but also are true to the outcomes that we may find matter most, even if they're not what the student wants to hear. And walking that balance is a problem in any consumer information tool, right, for choosing insurance plans, for K-12 students, and their families trying to choose a school or a school system. And it's going to take a lot more work than we've done so far to make that work right.
Yes, please.
I promised I wouldn't ask the question, but...
Go ahead.
Promised I wouldn't ask the question, but this directly goes to Larry and to Bridget. We have a very good handle on relationships with the SEAs, for the most part. But what we don't have a good handle on is relationship with some other state entities. In your administrative records issue, I'll just give you a brief example. We don't have a good handle on other post-employment health benefits and some pension issues. So we can't get that from the SEAs. And I would just like to ask about, and for example, charter school finances. There's administrative records at IRS, but we can't seem to get to those either. And so I just wondered about your suggestions about, through an administrative records technique and linking, how we can improve our relationship with these state entities that actually have this information on OPEB benefits and school finance and charter schools.
So great question. I'm taking it, there are specific pieces of data that you're thinking about, but you can imagine a broader question of how do we improve relationships for any kind of linkage. I think several things, one that Jack already said, you need to have a framework. And I think that framework both is legal, but also in terms of the data and the definitions. I remember in the early days of linkages of data that weren't necessarily with NCES, but across agency within a state, for example, having a common language, common definitions became really very important to make sure that when one person was saying research, the other person meant the same thing by it, or what a graduation rate was, or what persistence means, those kinds of things. But that is actually the advantage of being a federal agency, to help define and set the conventions with that, to help not only these agencies talk with you, but also to talk with each other and to talk across states. because that's oftentimes what states are looking at, wanting to know what the state next door is also doing so that they can make comparisons. So if you can help figure that out. But the legal parts of it, I think, in working through FERPA issues for years, you oftentimes will find people throw their hands up and say, I can't do that. I can't do that. This is my interpretation of the law. And I know there has been some movement at IES to try to clarify those kinds of laws. But if you can get one agreement in place that has been vetted by all the lawyers in the world, which will take you years or months, maybe if you're lucky, if you can get one agreement, oftentimes you find that if you can just repeat that agreement, maybe changing just one word, it gets easier for the second. Once you have a little bit of success, it becomes much easier to do it again and to do it again and so forth. But a third piece of advice would be in talking and trying to link with partners. It's important to bring the partners to the table to ask them what they want to know. Mm-hmm. What are they going to get out of these exchanges? And so framing it less so about your needs, and you may find you have many mutually beneficial kinds of things that you would want to do, and starting with that commonality, what is it that these charter schools want to know about what other charter schools are doing in other states near or far? Starting with and asking them, so you're making a two-way street, you'll get a lot farther in any kind of agreement that you're trying to do, whether it be with the state or a district or a set of schools, that sort of thing. Education is such that there are so many questions and so many problems we want to work on. It's likely that you'll find at least a few that you have in common, and you can start there.
Yes, please. George.
Yeah, George Bornstead. We always hear that schools matter, and we know that, in fact, schools are the entities that are most often held accountable. And I've always wondered why, NCES hasn't had a longitudinal study of schools where you wouldn't simply look at the characteristics of the students in the school, but you'd look at the organizational characteristics of school and how they might change over time, their curricula and so on. Are there professional learning communities within the schools? And so looking forward, I would think that that's something I would like to have a serious discussion and thinking about.
All right, we'll put that on the birthday wish list. Pat, did I see your hand up? Yeah. And then we'll.
As I reflect on your terrific comments about the complex and innovative work needed in the future to carry our field over the next decades, I have a two-part question for you. Do you feel we have an adequate pipeline of well-trained and available experts and young minds to take up this work in our state agencies and in our federal agencies? And second, if we don't, what would you recommend that AERA and ASA should do to attract the best minds to take on the psychometric and statistical work ahead so that we can fulfill the visions you were laying out for NCES?
So for part two, Larry?
Please, no.
I'm optimistic about this because one of the things that I think I observe, and maybe it's just what I want to see, but I think there's some evidence that's actually there, is that young people who are quantitatively inclined are coming back to statistics and psychometrics in droves, and part of the reason is that they realize it's a way to make a difference in the world. And that's what got me involved in this business to begin with, and I think that after a period in which people were with quantitative inclinations were sort of deciding on finance to make a lot of money, there seem to be an awful lot of people now interested in making a difference in the world, and they see this and they see education as one of the ways to do that. So I'm actually optimistic about that. The one thing I would say about state agencies is that I don't think the problem is supply there. I think the problem is there's just not enough money in state agencies to pay the people, even if the supply is there. And I think that's one of the things that makes some of these other things we've been talking about, like linkage to state data, more complex. It's not just that there's FERPA, it's that there's nobody that the person you have to deal with about FERPA has a whole bunch of other things to do, and that's not one of the things they're supposed to be doing, or at least one of the things anybody cares about.
I mean, I definitely agree with the first part. I've seen, and I think there's a few things you can credit to this. Certainly, I would argue the creation of IES and the way it has incentivized a sort of a higher level of scientific reasoning and inquiry in education has really led to an increase in the average quality. Quality is a terrible word to use, right? But in the sort of the training and interest in issues in education, the average, again, there I go again. The kinds of people that, for example, I hire researchers every month, and it's not hard to find ones that are fantastic, where in days past it was not so easy. There are more economists, for example, that have embraced education as an actual area to work in for a substantial, if not the bulk of their career, as opposed to just a sideline in labor economics. There are more psychometricians that got pulled in because of changes in testing, and now realize that there's more to life than just doing the validity, check on a state testing program. But the second part of your question I'm worried about, which was, how do we get them into our federal agencies and our state agencies? And just because there's more of them doesn't mean that the market doesn't work that way. And, NCES folks here today can speak more recently to this, but even when I was there in a time of sequestration, we had to lose 3 people in order to hire 1, and I would imagine it's worse now. There's not a demand, or there's not investment being made in the state and federal government side to bring those great people in, and that's going to be a challenge. The good news is the supply is there.
Yeah, I think it's important to underscore the good news. If I could just speak for a moment, from the Scientific Society point of view, AERA and I think the American Statistical Association have large and important investments in building the next generation of highly qualified scholars to do this work. AERA has had a long-standing grants program that is essentially dedicated to the advanced statistical analysis of large-scale data sets in education and learning, and there are parallel activities in the American Statistical Association. Now, if this were a different forum than a birthday party, I would say those dollars have really shrunk, that we have a talent pool, and we could have an enlarged talent pool given the high-quality doctoral production in education research and its interrelated disciplines, but that's not quite the moment for that pitch. Although I think embedded in Pat's question is that issue of how do we continue to nurture and develop this high-quality pipeline. I do think the point that Jack emphasized we should underscore, and I think the difficulties in the human resources available to all of the statistical agencies, NCES included, is a short-term challenge we just really need to address, and one that is painful across agencies to be able to do the innovative work and the innovative ideas with the appropriate planning and implementation and the capacity to work with the external community and the contractors that have brought this diverse group here today. So I want to conclude by, of course, thanking this forum, of which Peggy Carr, as our acting commissioner, kind of kicked this off with a very sensitive and nuanced reflections on our history and our opportunities, and Bridget and Jack and Larry. It's always easy when you're sharing and you know that you can invite a talent pool, and wherever they are, they say yes, because NCES is important. Statistics and data and trustworthy knowledge is what drives all of us across the federal statistical system, nationally and internationally. And while you migrate to the reception, now those of you who are with us virtually, you will miss the reception, but the birthday party will be another and further opportunity to continue this informal conversation. The elevators are to the left, the stairs are also to the left, and it's in 562. So happy birthday, NCES, and may we look forward to the next celebrations of this very fine agency.